It's just a great pleasure to introduce our three speakers. Willey, is it Willey? Yes, who's the presenter of today's very, very interesting paper, is Assistant Professor of Feminist Science Studies at University of Massachusetts at Amherst. She has a faculty appointment in Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies, and she's one of these people that we dreamed about when we first started Women's Studies program at Dartmouth in the late 1970s. Somebody who would have bachelor's degrees in Women and Gender Studies and emerge as this new breed of person who would help us understand gender and sexuality and women in a truly interdisciplinary fashion. Angie has her PhD from Emory, and she's right now at work on a book on monogamy, which I think this is a part of, or an offshoot of, or related to. And the book is called Monogamy, the Politics of Science and the Possibilities of Biology. She's also the author of several articles, Constituting Compulsory Monogamy, Normative Femininity and at the Limits of the Imagination, which is currently under review, and another forthcoming co-authored article, The Mating Life of Geeks, Love, Neuroscience, and the New Autistic Subject. She's been awarded a number of fellowships, including this one from the Humanities Research Center at Rice, also a teaching fellowship from UMass Amherst, and an Interdisciplinary Studies Institute fellowship from UMass Amherst. So maybe should I introduce everybody at once, or, yeah, sure. Okay. So our two respondents are Susannah Heschel, a longtime friend and colleague, who is the author of numerous books and the winner of numerous awards. She has 4 honorary degrees, I noticed, somehow some new ones slipped in that I didn't even know about, from places like Trinity, Colorado College, the Augustana Theologische Hochschule in Germany, and St. Michael's College at the University of Toronto. She's the editor and author of numerous books. Most recently, let me just talk about some recent ones. Well, actually forthcoming, the book she's working on at the moment is The Jewish Fascination with Islam, the History of Jewish Scholarship on Islam, and its impact on modern Jewish self-understanding, which we're all looking forward to. Her book, The Aryan Jesus, Christian Theologians in the Bible and Nazi Germany, came out in 2008. And another recent book is Transnational Migration of Identity, Jews, Muslims, and the Modernity Debate. This was a special issue of Comparative Studies of South Asia, of which she was the guest editor. I think her other award-winning book won the National Jewish Book Award in 1998 is Abraham Geiger and the Jewish Jesus. So I'll leave it at that because it would take all afternoon to recite some of the other titles of Susannah's work. And it's also a pleasure to introduce Herrn, who comes to us from La Charité in Berlin. He's a specialist in cultural history, in gender studies, and in public health, and also the author of numerous books, and I have all the German titles, so that would be a quick exercise in translation, but let me just say that he's currently working on a book about the first Institute of Sexual Science. It's an illustrated monograph, 1919 to 1933. Recent book that just came out is a co-authored book, or co-edited book, Popular Sex, Media and Sexuality in Germany in the early 20th century. And he's also co-edited a book about the Charité between East and West, 1945 to 1992. Number of other volumes on sexuality and masculinity. So I think we'll start with Angie. Hi. Hi.
Those, as I said, were just some popular headlines about the nature of monogamy from the last 3 years. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the contemporary science of monogamy to try to contextualize this paper a little bit more. So I don't have much time, but I thought it would be helpful for you to understand more about where I'm coming from. I'm really excited to have the opportunity to workshop this paper with this group. So I wanted to give you a little more context. So I work at the intersection of feminist science studies and queer feminist theory in an emerging field of what some folks are calling queer feminist science studies. I'm interested in challenging the naturalization of coupled forms of social belonging, where care is privatized within the family, and at the same time in challenging the epistemic authority accorded certain explanatory regimes, particularly those that pass as scientific, when and where they do. My work has looked at the pre-theoretical assumptions about the nature of difference and claims that monogamy is natural and unnatural in monogamy gene research and in popular polyamory literature. Polyamory is many loves. It's a sort of ethical non-monogamy movement and whatever, for those of you who are unfamiliar with the term. So I'm concerned to historicize this debate. My hope is that historicizing debates about non/monogamy as something that humans, populations, and or individuals are, instead of something that folks do, will help illuminate the work that this debate does. One of the things it does, through its reproduction of an evolutionary temporality that situates non-monogamy before, is to evoke problematic conceptions of racial difference. Turning to that moment where sexuality became the truth of the self, to look for monogamy in the history of sexuality, what has struck me is how unintelligible any science of monogamy would have been without reference to the geographically distanced other who comes to stand in for the temporally distanced other, our evolutionary before. So super quickly, I want to bombard you with primary source material from the contemporary science of monogamy, because this is such a great opportunity for me to pick your brains about how I'm thinking about historicizing this. So I put the dates there, since I'm not trained as a historian, it made me feel fun. So 1995 is somewhat arbitrary as a beginning. This is the date of the first PubMed result for the search terms brain and love. Though discussions of circulating levels of hormones associated with love were discussed beforehand, this seems to mark the fixing of a certain understanding of hormone receptors and their distribution in different parts of the brain as key to understanding monogamy. So this publication, The Monogamous Brain, marks the birth of the monogamous brains. To brief you on a few key actors here, Sue Carter is a biologist and behavioral neuroendocrinologist. I'm telling you a little bit about these characters because I'm thinking about some of the ways that we've tried to think about what sexology is as a discipline vis-a-vis science. So I'm trying to show you some of the contemporary messiness that I'm trying to think about too. So Sue Carter is a biologist and behavioral neuroendocrinologist. She's known as the first person to identify the physiological mechanisms responsible for social monogamy. She has a PhD in zoology from the University of Arkansas at Fayetteville. Tom Ensel is a neuroscientist and psychiatrist. Some of you may know who he is. Carter and Ensel, because he's the director of the National Institute of Mental Health. Carter and Ensel began work on the monogamous brain together at Yerkes Primate Research Center at Emory University, where Larry Young now heads the laboratory that continues their research today. As I said, Tom Ensel is the director of NIMH, and Carter is the co-director of the Brain Body Center at the University of Chicago, Illinois. The University of Illinois, Chicago, sorry. So my research on the neuroscience of monogamy has focused on Larry Young's laboratory. So this is a quick sampling of some of the primary literature on the neuroscience of monogamy. Some of these are editorials, not research articles, but they're all written by researchers in the field, not journalists. So most of these headlines, you'll note, reference Vole research. Claims about the discovery of the monogamy gene are based on Vole research. So the story, in a nutshell, is there are these two species of voles montane voles and prairie voles. Those of you who are from the US might appreciate the humor in this. The prairie voles from the Midwest are monogamous, the East Coast voles are promiscuous. And so basically they do a test, a partner preference test, which is how they measure monogamy. And they do things to the animals, gene manipulations or drug therapies, to make the promiscuous species score more like the monogamous species on the test. And whatever works in this regard to change the behavior to one species to make them behave more like the other is considered, then is something that can be used in clinical trials to treat autism and other asocial conditions. The link there, for those of you for whom it's not clear, is that whatever makes pair bonding rewarding, neurochemically speaking, is said to be the same process that makes social bonding in general rewarding. So where there are mentions of autism in the headlines, that should help contextualize that. So really quickly, this is a kind of schematic of the biology of love, compliments of Helen Fisher, biological anthropologist and author of 5 books and dozens of articles on the evolution and anatomy of love, and also the scientific advisor for chemistry.com, which is a subsidiary of match.com. It's a dating website. I thought this might help for understanding the scientific claims about love in more general terms. None of these systems were simply discovered by neuroscientists. They all have historical precedents that you all recognize. The study of these systems overlap, and it depends on, disciplines and sort of how these things are being mapped. Generally, these categories stay intact, and my work is on attachment or monogamy. So lust keeps you on the lookout for partners. It's always heterosexualized. Romantic love makes you stick around long enough to get attached to someone, and attachment makes you stay with them for long enough to get your offspring through dependence. So, okay, quick. These are headlines specifically about the lab I researched, referencing the discovery of a monogamy gene. Where are my cartoons? Okay, these are a couple of cartoons from the early 2000s. The first says, if you cheat on your spouse, you can't yet plead biochemistry in divorce court, but rodent brain research sheds light on why some lovers stay, some stray. The first suggests the implications of the research for thinking about individual variation, not just population level variation. The second is a gendered joke, of course, that evokes the very real therapeutic possibilities raised by this research. And then this is a lot of headlines from just a few years later, since 2008. These headlines on the science of love capture the growing reality of pharmaceutical implications of the research on monogamy. Intranasal oxytocin is being used in clinical trials with straight couples in counseling in Australia. On the flip side, some people are concerned to problematize the valuation of monogamy and have suggested that we look to our evolutionary past, represented in the literature by bonobos, early man, primitive societies, pre-colonial Hawaii, as representatives of our evolutionary past, for guidance on how to live in accord with our non-monogamous natures. Even among the groovy queer feminists, which is sort of where I looked to for an alternate discourse. So these are images of women frolicking in polyamorous bliss in the pages of the Polyamory Reader. My reading of them may be clear, but I'll just say they appear to be taken by an outside observer. They rely on an ethnographic model for their effect. What Carla Williams calls the National Geographic approach. They rely on some idea of a simple, pure, and sexually uninhibited primitive to impart their meaning, that monogamy is natural. It's also really interesting how they're presented in the text itself. So there are different sections of the book. One is called Friends and Lovers and has pictures of white ladies drinking tea. And this section is called Living the Dream, and the photos are completely decontextualized, and it's the only place in the book where there are pictures of black women's bodies. So that's sort of the contemporary stuff. Can I just say really quickly, I want to challenge the naturalization of coupled forms of social belonging because it naturalizes capitalism, makes the privatization of care within the family seem inevitable.
Slow down.
It's okay, I hear you.
Okay, I don't, at the same time, I don't want to perform or endorse a simple reversal that fetishizes non-monogamy as liberatory and more natural. I presume from the outset that race is important to how questions about monogamy are framed, and I'm concerned to think about how racist fantasies, to use Joan Scott's language, inform the intelligibility of monogamy as a bioscientific object. So these are some of my...
So what can I say in response that might be useful? This is not my field in the least. So let me throw in a couple of possible thoughts. One has to do with the role of religion. Which jump right down. And religion seems to me to be playing a role in how people think about sexuality generally, and especially monogamy. And yet at the same time, when we think about religion, actually there is no clear-cut position in Christianity, Judaism, or Islam regarding monogamy. In fact, Jews, certainly we have even contracts as late as the 16th, 17th century in Italy, had contracts with a pilegesh, with a concubine. The Jewish men could have a concubine. And that, of course, raises the other question, is there such a thing as generic monogamy? Are we talking here about, one of the debates in the early church was digamy, which is you marry one, and then can a man marry a second wife after the first one has died? Is that permissible, etc.? Well, listen, is it about men or is it about women? And usually monogamy, what can I say? I think it affects men and women and class issues, etc. I won't go into that, but that's obvious. Okay. So one thing is the role of religion in all of this, and in that connection, I also wonder a bit about some of the science as some translations of theological claims and assumptions, and also the use by religious organizations of the science. Now I have to also mention, since you brought up oxytocin and vasopressin, I actually did my senior thesis at Rockefeller University on the use of ethanol to inhibit the release of the neurohypophyseal hormones, namely vasopressin and oxytocin. But in those days, the context was entirely different. But nowadays, I do know that right-wing religious groups, including, for example, your Chabad, joking, I mean make use of this. And that is, see, science proves that we're right. And that's something that worries me considerably, of course. And it's not a new phenomenon. Science will jump on racial theory and say it proves that Genesis is right, as they said at the turn of the century. Certain Protestant theologians in Germany and elsewhere. But then there are other kinds of issues as well here in your paper. I wonder a bit if we might talk about, first of all, about Islam. You talk on page 16 about Muslims being vilified. And of course it's true when I'm writing now, as Marianne mentioned, a book about scholarship on Islam in Europe from the 1830s to the 1930s, and I'm looking in particular at Jewish scholarship, but of course in a larger context. Were Muslims vilified? Yes and no. They were also objects of attraction, exoticism. I even wonder sometimes the literature that your colleague Joseph Mossad writes about is not such a okay. When he talks about the exploitation, the sexual exploitation of some of these European travelers to Islamic countries, it also opened the door to the possibility of experiencing and expressing sexual desire in ways that perhaps might not have been otherwise. So I would say that there's an ambiguity here. It's not just about Islamophobia. And I have to say I appreciate some of the references in your article also that I hadn't known about. I appreciate that. But I do think we have to be more cautious. So I think, for example, in the European scene, there are different attitudes toward Islam in different eras and in different countries. And there's also a clear distinction between some of these Jewish scholars of Islam, especially between the 1830s and the 1880s, and their Christian counterparts in Germany. For Jews, Islam was the great religion. They identified with it, they put it on a pedestal. It was a religion that they called ethical monotheism, for instance. So I won't go into that, but it's not just a question of vilification, it's also a question of identifying. Judaism and Islam, we're together, and Christianity is the other. So I would only be cautious in that respect. And that, of course, would raise the question of Orientalism more generally, which is a term that we've thrown around here in our discussions an awful lot. And there is, in addition to Said's book, which doesn't really look at Germany, there's a wonderful book by Suzanne Marchand called German Orientalism in an Age of Empire, which is a much more detailed examination of the German scholarship in this field called Oriental Studies. And there she points out something very interesting, which is that so many of the people who came to the study of Oriental studies, especially of Islam, came from theological faculties with Christian theological interests and came to explore whatever it was, ancient Near East, let's say, or Buddhism. They looked at India because they wanted some kind of better understanding of Christianity, Christian origins, and so forth. So there's also that context for what we're calling Orientalism that, again, makes it more complicated. And, of course, there's always a sexual undertone and eroticism and so forth that's politicized in various different directions. But, again, not always in the negative. Yeah. And in that respect, I also wonder, when we talk about the racial motifs that are impregnated in modern science, can we make distinctions, and this came up with one of the first lectures we had in this institute, can we make distinctions between legitimate science, illegitimate science, science in the service of political ends, science simply in the service of justifying theology or race, let's say, but what can we say about, is it possible to identify certain scientific work that is in fact legitimate here, as best it can be done? Or what are the criteria that we would bring when we evaluate scientific research that, of course, 150 years ago, hey, it has no relevance today, but at the time, it was, despite what it looks like today, primitive, let's say, wrong or racist, is there something else there that we can say is a possibility? And then the last comment that I wanted to make has to do with a more general point that actually you bring up on page 18. Your quote there reminds me, from Krafft-Ebing, reminds me of another context, which is a passage that I find remarkable. This is from 1955 by Claude Lévi-Strauss, that perhaps you're familiar with, everybody already, on Islam. So here on page 18 of your paper, you say, you have this quote from Krafft-Ebing: "The Mohammedan woman is simply a means for sensual gratification and the propagation of species, whilst in the sunny balm of Christian doctrine blossom forth with divine virtues and qualities, housewife, companion, and mother." Contrast, etc. But, I think there's also something that's brought out, and I'll end with this quote by Lévi-Strauss. "Now I can see beyond Islam to India, but it is the India of Buddha, before Muhammad. For me as a European, and because I am a European, Muhammad intervenes with uncouth clumsiness between our thought and Indian doctrines that are very close to it, in such a way as to prevent East and West joining hands, as they might well have done in harmonious collaboration. If the West traces its internal tensions back to their source, it will see that Islam, by coming between Buddhism and Christianity, Islam Islamized us at a time when the West, by taking part in the Crusades, was involved in opposing it, and therefore came to resemble it, instead of undergoing, had Islam never come into being, a slow process of osmosis with Buddhism, which would have Christianized us still further, and would have made us all the more Christian, and that we would have gone back beyond Christianity itself. It was then that the West lost the opportunity of remaining female." Now, it's crazy, and it's completely, you don't expect the last word is a little unexpected. But all I want to do is point to this, that there are also broader imaginings within Europe and within European scholarship that play on these different religions and their intersection with gender, and clearly with sexuality as well. So, there you go.
Unfortunately, Klaus, my host, were not able just to have a look of the whole manuscript, so it could be something is not so well formulated like I would present it to you. Okay, I have written down, I cannot speak freely like Susannah because my English is not so well. Angi's draft is neatly written and well organized, coalescing around the central topic in the emerging sexology at the turn of the 19th and early 20th century, contributing to stabilizing of the hegemonic Christian way of life, the monogamous marriage. Sorry. Your paper is theoretically well informed, providing a wide range for the interpretation of the contemporary discourses. My reading aims at two aspects: the sources you used and the background in which these debates emerged. In your initial remarks, Angie shows the broad range of the current debate around monogamy. I would like to know the reasons for the emergence of that debate and the context in which they arose. Why do scientific and popular media pick up the discourse of naturalness today, which I thought we had overcome decades before? I would assume that one of the reasons may be the new discussion about morality in the US in the young generation, which is more or less a counter-movement to the overall concept of sexual liberation, which marks the counterculture generation, the baby boomers, on the one hand, and the increasing importance attributed to the science rather than to the humanities, which, in my view, can be considered as a double backlash. Both movements, the turn against the 1960s counterculture and the biologicalization, are intrinsically interwoven. Since the 90s, a new idealization of premarital chastity and sexual faithfulness gained value, supposed by moralists and prominent media figures even within the popular culture, irrespective the sexual orientation, homo or heterosexual. Moral values provide orientation and safety in a constantly shifting and threatening world. For the young generation, these values simultaneously serve as a demarcation to the parent generation and to define position all their own. In our concrete case, the AIDS crisis has supported this change of values. I agree with Angie to compare the surge of the gay gene with that of monogamy. The biopolitics of naturalness, which manifests itself in the height of the Human Genome Project, guarantees and solidifies the status quo. Therefore, Angie points out, I quote, "A central aim of this paper is a modest attempt to historize monogamy within something we may understand as a global science of sexuality." Page 9. Angie's text is divided into three parts that in part need different stages and must be more or less elaborated. The first one, the monogamy is human. The second, theorizing the global history of monogamy. And the third one, especially Islam, on the importance of heterosexual monogamy. I will say some words to each part of it. In the first part, Angie attempts to provide the context of sexology in which the debate about monogamy is embedded, with a special focus on the nature-nurture debate, a debate that evoked a strong polarization within the discipline sexology. It might be helpful to further elaborate on the societal development in the time when the discussion about monogamy entered the sexological debate. This period is not only designated by the implantation of perversion, quote, quote, as Foucault terms, but also by the belated gesture of the individuation of women. The first women's already questioned the scientifically justified, seemingly natural gender polarity is a result of the male-dominated academia. Against the backdrop of the 19th century modernization and industrialization, the structure of family and labor changed fundamentally, most prominently in the urban metropoles such as Paris, Vienna, Berlin or London. Not agrarian intended families, but the nuclear family became the model of the early modern time. In this process, marriage as well has been re-evaluated and acquired new meaning. Most important in this re-evaluation is the recharging of marriage with a romantic ideal of love, which, however, promised ephemeral transitoriness. In this debate, the historically, ethnographically, and evolutionary substantiated argument of monogamy entails the neutralization of the anxieties of monogamy's transitoriness by promising lifelong endurance. The second part, theorizing the global history of monogamy. The discussion about monogamy is, like Angie shows, of course to see in the context of the enforcement and stabilization of heterosexual norm, but more importantly, in my view, within the synchronic debate about female prostitution and the distribution of venereal diseases, which took an immensely space. Prostitution was the very center of the first sexual reform movement, where women raised their voices first, as well as in the sexological debate, where its international competing for abolition was the most important issue. See here, for instance, Ivan Bloch works about the history of prostitution and the history of syphilis. Here, the gendered, differentiated imaginary of traditionally promiscuous thought man and the monogamous, ich kann es glaube ich nicht aussprechen, sorry. Monogamous, thank you, defined woman marks the controversy on prostitution and monogamy at the same time. Because your topic is embedded in a wider sexological discourse and in large parts dominated by the polarized gender debate, I would recommend to provide the reader with the crucial information in these fields. Only once, page 6, you mention the gender construction of the white European woman, which is contrasted by the non-European man as counterfigure. I think a little bit similar to Susannah, I would emphasize another point. On page 10, Angie is using first the term pseudo-scientific, I do it in quotes, which I personally avoid. In the contemporary scientific understanding was what you call pseudo, but was by no means as supposed to be. It was well acknowledged in a broad field of science and humanities at the same time, from psychoanalysis over sexology, eugenics till economics. Naming it pseudo is, in my view, a distancing gesture from today's position, which tends to underestimate their historical importance and accepted former seriousness. Shortly later, you raise the question of what counts as science. In my opinion, I would answer social Darwinism surely too. On page 13, I quote, I draw on Krafft-Ebing's work as representative of a strong advocacy from the views that monogamous marriage separate the civilized from the barbaric, the superior from the inferior races. Alice, on the other hand, uses other cultures to problematize modern forms of marriage as artificial and unnatural. That was a quote, Angie. I don't know whether my proposal is really productive, I must say, but I'm not sure whether the opposition concerning the different views of monogamy are best represented by Krafft-Ebing and have a look at this. As far as I see, were Krafft-Ebing and Ellis no contemporaries. Furthermore, was Krafft-Ebing in the discussion about monogamy only a marginal figure compiling accepted views. The most prominent protagonist in monogamy debate within the sexual discourse was a Finnish ethnologist and sociologist Edward Westermarck. Maybe his work is translated and could be regarded. Westermarck advocated the historical and evolutionary primacy of monogamy, and at the other side I would focus Ivan Bloch, denying Westermarck's position and emphasizing the primate of polygamy, as well as the historically and culturally transformability of the forms of human cohabitation. If you want to hold on your protagonists, it would be helpful to illuminate a bit more the discursive developments and shiftings from the monogamy debate from the late 19th to the early 20th century. Additionally, you call Krafft-Ebing Islamophobic, page 15. In my opinion, we should not pathologize the pathologizer. Krafft-Ebing's choice of polygamy of the Turkish Islam as counterpoint to the Western Christian tradition of monogamy rooted in the history of the relation of both countries. Since the second Turkish occupation of Austria in the 7th century, the first took place in the 16th century, Turkey was not only a symbolic threat of the Occident by the Orient, but a very concrete one. Since that collective trauma of the Austrians, generations of scientists and historians used the Turkey as negative counterpart for all purposes. So Krafft-Ebing did. The third part, I make it very short. The third part of your paper is not as elaborated as the first chapters and seems to me more a work in progress, containing very interesting quotes of both protagonists. It is not my intention here to defend Krafft-Ebing, but I would like to draw more attention on the paragraphs you used from his Psychopathia, Sexualis, besides the problems of translation you mentioned with Heike Bauer's work. Some of the quotes seems to me a bit taken out of the context. My reading of the text around your quotations proposes that Krafft-Ebing is not so much focused on monogamy as you proposes, instead of different statuses of women in both cultural contexts, Orient versus Occident. It was surprising for me to see how much Krafft-Ebing acknowledged the effort of the Western women's emancipation movement, of course, using to show the superiority of Christianity over the Islamic culture. Okay, and here I have the pages with me, so from the quotation, so they are embedded in much more in chapters and in notations about the women's emancipation movement, and as also it is, I must say, the 14th edition is made by Alfred Fuchs. It means it's published after the death of Krafft-Ebing, so it would be better to have a real Krafft-Ebing to take the last edition before his death. It's the 12th one of 1903. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.